think about your average day, maybe scrolling through endless entertainment options, grabbing pretty much whatever food you feel like. Now, try to picture a time when just finding enough food to survive was, well, a daily battle for millions. That's the stark reality we're diving into today, the Great Depression.
Yeah, and this wasn't just some blip in economic history. It was profound. It had roots stretching way beyond just one single cause. And its impact, well, it touched almost every part of life.
Right.
We've looked at a whole range of perspectives,
Yeah.
Historical analyses, economic studies, and some really deeply personal stories to try and get a real handle on the complexities.
Exactly. Our goal isn't just to, retell the same old story. We want to uncover the surprising layers, the intense human side of it, and the lessons that still stick with us from the Great Depression. Okay, so let's unpack this. Where did this whole dramatic period actually kick off?
Well, for most people, the thing they point to, the most visible starting point, is the stock market crash of 1929. See, throughout the 1920s, stock prices had seen this incredible growth, and more people, ordinary people, wanted in. It looks like an easy way to build wealth.
It sounds like everyone just thought the party would never end, basically.
That's pretty much it, yeah. And a key way lots of folks, even those without much spare cash, got involved was by buying stocks on margin.
On margin, what's that?
Okay, imagine you want to buy, say, $100 worth of stock, but you only actually pay $10 of your own money and you borrow the other $90 from your broker.
Okay, so a small down payment, loan for the rest. What's the catch?
Well, when prices are going up, it's great. Your returns are magnified because you're controlling a bigger asset with less of your own cash.
Right.
But the danger, the huge danger, comes when prices start to fall. If your stock loses value, the broker can hit you with a margin call. They demand you put in more money right now to cover those potential losses.
And if you can't?
If you can't come up with the cash, they can just sell your stocks, often at a loss, just to get their loan money back. So basically, margin buying amplified everything. It turned a market downturn into this rapid, cascading financial meltdown.
Ouch. Yeah, that sounds incredibly risky. Like a house of cards just waiting.
Yeah.
So what actually triggered the collapse back in 29?
Well, in October of that year, the market, which seemed unstoppable, started to wobble. On October 24th, a day we now call Black Thursday, there was this massive wave of selling.
Panic selling.
Total panic. Prices just plummeted. There was a bit of a temporary rebound. Some big bankers tried to prop things up, but the relief was, well, it was very short-lived.
So it didn't hold.
No. Black Monday and then Black Tuesday followed right after, and the drops were even more devastating. We're talking trillions of dollars in value, corporate, personal wealth. It just, poof, vanished.
Yeah.
The whole optimistic vibe of the Roaring '20s, gone. Evaporated right along with the stock values. And the economy tipped into this period of deflation where prices actually started falling.
So the crash was the big spark, the trigger. But were there other weaknesses already there in the economy that made it so vulnerable to that kind of shock?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. While the crash was dramatic, you're right. Several underlying economic problems basically amplified its impact massively. A major one was the crisis down on the farms in agriculture.
Agriculture. How so?
Well, after World War I, European farming started to recover. And suddenly, American farmers who had been supplying Europe during the war lost those crucial export markets.
Ah, okay. So the demand for American food just kind of dried up overseas.
Exactly. And that led to this huge oversupply of crops. Think wheat, corn, and naturally, prices just crashed. Farmers were in a really dire situation.
Mm-hmm.
There are even stories, of corn becoming so cheap, it was actually more economical for farmers to burn it for fuel than to buy coal.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah. So many farmers faced foreclosure. They lost their farms. And ironically, they often tried to grow more crops to make up for the low prices, which, of course, just made the oversupply even worse in the long run. It was a terrible cycle.
That paints a really grim picture for rural America already, even before the Wall Street crash fully hit.
Mm-hmm.
What else was going on that contributed?
Global trade policies. That was another big piece of the puzzle.
Right.
To try and protect American industries, the U.S. government jacked up tariffs. Those are taxes on imported goods, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially on farm products coming from Europe.
The idea being, I guess, to make American stuff cheaper at home.
That was the theory, yeah. Make American products more competitive.
Yeah.
However, other countries didn't just sit back. They retaliated. They slapped their own tariffs on American goods.
Oh, like a trade war.
Pretty much, yeah. It sparked this dramatic downward spiral in international trade. It's estimated that global trade just plummeted by something like 66% between 1929 and 1934.
Two-thirds.
Yeah, it became this period of intense protectionism that really just choked off economic activity everywhere. Less trade meant less demand for goods and services, across the board.
So less buying and selling worldwide. And you mentioned debt earlier, too. How did too much debt fit into all this?
Well, it loops back to that margin trading we talked about with the stock market.
Right, the borrowing.
Exactly. As the market tanked, all those investors who'd borrowed heavily faced those margin calls we mentioned.
And they didn't have the money.
They didn't have the money. So they were forced to sell their stocks, often at rock bottom prices, which just drove prices down even further. It created this chain reaction of liquidations, bankruptcies, not just in the stock market, but it rippled through the whole financial system, banks included.
It really sounds like this fragile economic system just completely came apart at the seams. It's easy to get lost in the economics, though, the big numbers. What did all of this actually mean for regular people?
Yeah.
What was the human cost?
Oh, the impact on individuals, on families. It was devastating. And it had these really long-lasting effects. For so many, it became just a daily battle for sheer survival. You see these incredible examples of people becoming unbelievably resourceful just out of absolute necessity. They'd save and reuse everything. Wrapping paper, bits of string, tiny rubber bands.
Things we wouldn't even think twice about throwing away
Well,
today.
not even think twice. There are accounts of people making their own glue, just from flour and water for everyday fixes. And the psychological impact, that constant scarcity, it stayed with people for decades. Even after things got better financially, that deep-seated fear of not having enough, it was ingrained.
You still hear those stories, don't you? About people who lived through it, grandparents maybe, who never threw anything away, ever.
Exactly that. And for some, the desperation was, well, it was even more extreme. There are truly heartbreaking stories of families having to eat their pets or even boiling animal hides just for some tiny bit of nourishment, just to stave off starvation.
Oh, that's just awful.
It really is. One person remembered their grandfather saying he had no memories of playing as a child. Survival was just too all-consuming. There was no room for childhood.
Wow.
Another story recounts a grandmother who, as a child, unknowingly ate her pet rabbit because her parents, desperate, had told her it was chicken.
Goodness. Those stories are just gut-wrenching.
They really are. And there's another one, quite touching actually, about children who would come home from school for lunch, not because there was much food, often there wasn't, but because they were ashamed not to have anything to bring, like the other kids might have.
Oh, great.
And one day, their parents had somehow managed to scrape together some mashed potatoes. They served them in fancy glass dishes, pretending it was ice cream. Just a small act of love, trying to a tiny bit of joy or normalcy into this incredibly hard time.
Little moments of dignity.
Exactly. And fathers trying to keep shoes on their kids' feet, patching worn-out soles with bits of cowhide they managed to find.
It's just a completely different world than most of us can even comprehend today.
It truly is. Even, the large numbers of people who became homeless, often called hobos back then, they developed this whole sort of secret code. Markings left near houses or towns to let others know if it was a safe place, maybe somewhere you could get a little food, or a place to avoid. A hidden language of survival.
Incredible. So, faced with all this suffering, this widespread hardship, what did the government do? This is where the New Deal comes in, isn't it?
Yes, exactly. The New Deal. That was the name given to a whole series of programs and reforms initiated by President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR. The aims were basically threefold: relief, recovery, and reform. Immediate help for the unemployed, getting the economy back on its feet, and making changes to try and prevent a crisis like this from happening again.
Okay.
Now, initially, a lot of these programs were primarily focused on men. That reflected the common idea back then, the breadwinner concept. The husband was the main provider.
Right, that was the thinking.
But it pretty quickly became clear that women were also suffering immensely and desperately needed support too, so the approach had to evolve.
So they adapted.
They did. You saw specific efforts aimed at that struggling farm sector we talked about. Things like the Bankhead Cotton Control Act, which tried to raise cotton prices by limiting production. The Farm Credit Act helped farmers refinance their mortgages, trying to stop them losing their land.
Right.
And the Soil Conservation and Domestic Allotment Act encouraged better farming practices to prevent that awful soil erosion that led to the Dust Bowl catastrophe in the plains.
Okay, so helped for farmers.
Yeah.
What about the banks? You said the financial system was collapsing?
Yeah, that was critical. Roosevelt took very decisive action almost immediately to try and restore people's faith in the banking system. He declared a nationwide banking holiday.
Meaning all banks just closed?
For a few days, yes. It stopped the panic the bank runs, where everyone rushes to withdraw their money, fearing the bank will fail. Then, behind the scenes, they assessed the banks, introduced reforms, and Roosevelt famously went on the radio for his fireside chats. He spoke directly to the American people, explaining in simple terms what was being done to make the banks safer. It was incredibly effective in calming fears and starting to stabilize the financial system.
Those fireside chats are legendary, aren't they? And then there were the big work programs, the ones people often think of with the New Deal.
Absolutely. The Works Progress Administration, the WPA, was probably the most famous. It was a massive initiative. It gave millions of unemployed Americans jobs working on public projects.
Like building things.
Exactly. Building roads, bridges, schools, hospitals, parks, airports, essential infrastructure that benefited communities all across the country. It provided work, a paycheck, and importantly, a sense of purpose and dignity during a really tough time.
Yeah, that must have been huge.
It was. Though it's important to remember, these WTA jobs generally paid less than private sector jobs would have. They weren't meant to compete with private enterprise, more to provide a safety net.
Gotcha. Sounds like the New Deal really touched a lot of different areas of American life then.
It really did. Labor reforms were another key part. Banning child labor, setting minimum wage standards in some industries, and crucially, recognizing workers' rights to organize and form unions.
So strengthening workers' rights.
Yes, but, it wasn't all positive or universally beneficial. For instance, the practice known as redlining, which was actually reinforced by some federal housing policies at the time, systematically denied mortgages and insurance to people in certain neighborhoods, often based on race. This had devastating, long-lasting negative consequences, particularly for minority communities.
That's a really important point. Even well-intentioned efforts can have these unintended or sometimes intended but discriminatory side effects. Was there, agreement at the time on whether the New Deal was actually working? Did it end the Depression?
Well, that's a question economists still debate today, actually. Oh, yeah. Many people back then, and some economists still now, who believed strongly in balanced government budgets, were very critical of the New Deal's large spending programs. They didn't buy into the idea, which later became known as Keynesian economics, that government should deliberately spend more money, even go into debt, during a downturn to stimulate the economy.
So different fundamental ideas about the government's role. But I've also heard arguments that maybe something else was really key to the recovery, something to do with, the amount of money circulating. Monetary policy.
Yes, that's a very significant argument. There's strong evidence suggesting that an increase in the money supply was actually a crucial factor in the recovery, especially in the mid to late 1930s.
How did that happen?
It happened largely because gold flowed into the U.S. Partly this was because the U.S. government devalued the dollar against gold in 1933, making it cheaper for foreigners to buy dollars. And partly because political instability and the rise of fascism in Europe after 1934 made people there nervous, so they moved their capital, their gold, to the perceived safety of the U.S.
Okay, so more gold coming in meant more money in the U.S. system.
Essentially, yes. Under the gold standard system they had then, more gold reserves allowed the money supply to expand. This, in turn, helped to lower real interest rates, the cost of borrowing after accounting for inflation, or in this case, deflation. Lower rates made it cheaper for businesses to invest and expand, and for consumers to borrow.
So cheaper borrowing helped get things moving again.
That's the theory, and quite a bit of economic analysis supports it. Some studies suggest this monetary expansion actually had a bigger positive impact on the recovery in the years before World War II than the New Deal's fiscal policies, the government spending programs.
Oh, interesting.
And what's also interesting is that this monetary expansion wasn't really the result of some deliberate modern-style monetary policy decision. It was more of a byproduct of other policies, like the dollar devaluation and external events like capital flight from Europe. The main hope behind tweaking the gold price was actually just to raise overall price levels, not necessarily a sophisticated plan to lower interest rates.
So kind of an accidental success on the monetary front, in a way.
You could argue that, yeah, in some ways. Now, zooming out again, looking at the bigger picture, the global context is really important too.
Right, wasn't just America.
No, not at all. The Great Depression was very much a global phenomenon. Many European countries were already facing economic headwinds, even recessionary tendencies, before the U.S. crash in 1929.
Oh, okay.
And the severity, how deep the downturn was, and how long it lasted varied quite a bit from country to country. Some economies shrank much more dramatically than others. Some recovered faster.
So it wasn't a uniform experience across the world.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
And this variation suggests that maybe how well a country's major trading partners were doing could have played a role in its own recovery. If Germany starts buying more British goods, that helps Britain, that
Yeah.
kind of thing. International trade links matter.
Like interconnectedness.
But despite all these factors, the general consensus is that the U.S. economy didn't really reach full employment again, didn't fully shake off the Depression's effects until the massive government spending and industrial mobilization that came with World War II.
It took a world war.
It seems so. During the war years, the total output of the U.S. economy, the GNP, basically doubled. Factories were running 20/47. Everyone who could work had a job.
It's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it? That it
It
took
was.
that kind of global conflict to finally achieve full economic recovery.
It is. And an interesting side effect of that wartime economy with full employment and high demand for labor was that income inequality actually decreased significantly. The gap between the rich and the poor narrowed quite a bit during those war years.
Okay, so let's try and sort of wrap this up. It sounds like the Great Depression was this incredibly complex storm, wasn't it? You had all these interconnected things, the stock market crash acting as a trigger, sure, but also deep problems in farming, global trade seizing up because of tariffs, way too much debt, especially from that margin buying.
Right. And then the government's response with the New Deal, providing relief, trying reforms, but also facing criticism and having mixed results. Plus these less intentional factors like the monetary expansion from gold inflows.
And ultimately, the massive economic shift caused by World War II.
Exactly. It just wasn't a simple story with one cause and one easy solution. The human cost, the suffering was immense, and it truly shaped the attitudes and fears of an entire generation. You can't overstate that.
Yeah.
And while the New Deal provided absolutely vital relief and put in place some really important long-term reforms, things like Social Security, banking regulations, the full recovery seems tied to that complex mix, including the monetary effects and finally the global upheaval of the war.
It really makes you think about today, doesn't it? We still grapple with economic stability. We talk about social safety nets, about how people and societies cope with really hard times. What can we still, take away from the Great Depression? About our own vulnerabilities? Maybe, but also our strengths when we face big economic shocks. It's definitely something to mull over. Well, thanks for taking that really deep dive with us into such a massive topic. And to you listening, we hope this sparks some thoughts. Maybe think about those personal stories we shared, or perhaps dig deeper into some part of the Depression era that caught your interest.